If you've been watching mainstream media over the past few days, you'll know that they've been attacking Bernie Sanders left and right over an issue with worker pay and whether or not Bernie Sanders is paying his workers $15 an hour. Now, this is an absolute smear job that's being run right now, and we're going to talk about why that is. But first, I want to show you a clip from Tucker Carlson talking about the issue, and we're going to use his segment to talk about the issue more broadly.
Well, there are more than 20 Democrats campaigning to be next president of the United States, and with so many options, you'd think the Democratic voters would have a lot of choices, but really they don't have a lot of choices. They only control the cosmetic appearance of their next candidate. They can decide whether their nominee will be running to be the first Hispanic president or the first female president or the first gay president. But in everything that actually matters, in other words, what they believe, they're pretty much the same. All of them will be running on a platform of open borders, open prisons, free health care for illegals, etc. And all of them have the same tone of their campaign. They all spend the election campaign asserting their superiority to the country. They deserve to be president not simply because they're better than Donald Trump, but because morally they're better than you too. On the campaign trail, Bernie Sanders has been zealously demanding that other people and other businesses increase their minimum wage to $15 an hour. For example, he's accused Walmart of paying its employees, quote, starvation wages. He's also celebrated workers who have protested and gone on strike to demand a pay increase right now. Watch this.
I want to applaud the thousands and thousands of workers from coast to coast, people who work at McDonald's, people who work at Burger King, people who work all over this country, who have stood up over the years and demanded that the federal minimum wage be raised to a living wage, $15 an hour.
Okay, well, he couldn't have been clearer about that. So you would expect in the way that he lives, Sanders would set a good example for the rest of the country. But it turns out, and you may have guessed this, Bernie is so confident that he is a deeply good person and his cause is just, that he's just not shackled to the same rules that he wants everyone else to follow. For example, right now, Sanders' campaign is battling its own campaign workers. They say they're being paid the same starvation wages that Walmart employees get, less than $13 an hour. Sanders hasn't budged, though. If they aren't happy, they can go work on another campaign or they can quit. That's his position. If his presidential campaign doesn't work out, maybe he should manage a Walmart. He'd probably be pretty good at it, based on his...
Okay, that is absolute ridiculousness. That is not true at all. So the first thing that you need to know about why, about this story and why Tucker Carlson is so full of it is that Bernie Sanders' campaign was the first campaign ever to unionize. So, by the way, that just shows you how dedicated and committed Bernie Sanders is to his values. That he's actually going to have a union here. So now the thing you need to understand is, so the base pay for a field staff on the Bernie Sanders campaign is $36,000. Now, which by the way is astronomical. Trust me, I know. $36,000 for a base pay for a field staff work is pretty much like the best pay in the business. Like, he pays his workers really well. But the reason why this debate is happening right now is because $36,000 works out to be over $15 an hour if you're working if you're working like under a 40-hour work week, which is how it started in the campaign. Now, as what happens with with essentially all political campaigns, you end up working more than 40 hours. So as soon as Bernie Sanders figured this out, he turned around and said, well, we've got to raise their pay in order to reach 60 an hour. But the union wasn't happy with essentially what Bernie Sanders came around with and said, well, we should cut hours, because that's the whole debate right now. Because apparently because the mainstream media is running with this narrative of Bernie Sanders raised pay and then cut hours. That's not how it happened. The union turned around and said, well, thank you for raising pay, but we also want it to be the case that we're not working. Which, by the way, as someone who has been around a lot of campaign work, I can tell you right now, that's a good thing. I know someone right now who's the campaign manager of a county-wide race, just a county-wide race in Northern Virginia. And he works about 7 days a week, 6 to 7 days a week, almost 9 hours a day. Like, he'll almost all day, and sometimes he's working during the night. It's just like all over the place. That is what it's like to work on a campaign. So for Bernie Sanders to come around and say, hey, it's okay, and we're not going to have you working more than 40 hours. We're going to remove that crazy incentive to be working more and more and more hours, because that's what happens. People come around and they look at you funny for not working, for not staying late every single day. They're like, "Oh, that person's lazy." It's like you're not pitching in, and that's the sort of cycle that ends up happening. So Bernie Sanders said, "Hey, well, you can't be the union," and Bernie Sanders said, "Well, you can't be working more than uh the than 40 hours, even though we've already raised your pay, because we're not comfortable with you making less than $15 an hour." Bernie Sanders is so committed to you making at least $15 an hour that he's not okay with you working longer. Now, the thing though is they are still in negotiations. The union, Bernie Sanders campaign and the union are still in negotiation with one another over what the pay rate is going to look like past 40 an hour or past 40-hour work week. So they're still having that debate. But the mainstream media turns around, including Tucker Carlson, as we just saw, and absolutely smears him, making stuff up. Like, it's just not true. So the question, though, becomes, why is this the case? Why is it the case that the mainstream media ran with this story, which shouldn't have ever really become a story because it's an insider negotiation? My theory, and by the way, Kyle Kulinski has also suggested this. But my theory is, honestly, I think there's probably a mole in the campaign. There is a mole in the campaign, and that's not just being conspiratorial. Like, that is something that happens on political campaigns. People from the opposition, whether it's a Republican or whether it's a Democrat from another campaign, or just someone with sort of compromised interest or something of the sort. Maybe it's just someone who got in it for the money, doesn't really care about Bernie Sanders, and saw an opportunity to leak a story or something, right? But there very likely could be a mole in the Bernie Sanders campaign, or multiple people who aren't super loyal to Bernie Sanders. Because it might not be a mole, it could just be someone who, saw an opportunity to leak a story, maybe make a few bucks. Um, and that is how these negotiations are becoming news. And by the way, notice how when they became news, they were completely out of context and misleading, and everybody, you know, everybody's running with this fake story. And so it's absolute nonsense. Bernie Sanders is like literally the least hypocritical guy that is running for office ever. I mean, you can find videos of him saying the exact same thing from like 30 years ago. He's not turning around flip flopping on you. And by the way, this is the last point I want to raise here. Tucker Carlson said at the beginning of that segment that all the Democrats are the same. That is ridiculous. Do you honestly think to yourself that any of the other Democrats would be this committed to making sure that all their workers are making $15 an hour? I don't think so. In fact, I know so, because Bernie Sanders already has essentially the best pay of campaigns. Some of the best. I'm not going to say the best, and it depends on um, which which position you're looking at. Some of the other campaigns, like Joe Biden's campaign, I think like some of their top paid people are paid really really high, whereas Bernie Sanders' campaign, the pay is like even the entry pay is sort of very good. Is how I mean to say. So no, not all of the candidates are the same. Some of them really fight for their values, and one of those people, or the the person who's fighting for that, really is Bernie Sanders.